Thanks, Crawford. Good morning. What I'm going to talk to you about this morning is the exciting but chaotic world of mobility. You know, more and more people are using more and more mobile devices all the time. In fact, I'd say it's probably reached the point where many of you can't even imagine what life would be like without all those mobile devices. It's just absolutely crazy how many different things are out there. So what I'm going to talk to you about this morning is the fact that this world of mobile devices is not just about the devices. In fact, this world is about devices and platforms and services all mashed together. I need my clicker. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to introduce you to some new concepts that I hope will make it all clear. And then along the way, just to spice things up, I'm also going to talk about etymology and squirrels. Now, the key takeaway of my talk is while there is convergence in the world of mobile devices, it's not exactly where you expect it to be. In fact, when it comes to devices and platforms and applications, there's a huge amount of divergence. The convergence is in the data and services that enable all these things to work together. Now, in order to achieve that convergence, companies are going to have to focus on the individual, both as a consumer and as an individual employee of an organization, and figure out an ecosystem that allows all of these different elements to work together in a seamless way. In other words, what you need to do is not just consumerize IT, but individualize IT. Now, there's a lot of challenges along the way in order to achieve this vision, but challenges create opportunities. And we see lots of opportunities out there for both large companies and small ones. So I'm going to start with an overview of the big picture. Here at the center of the picture, we have this notion of everything mobile, where we have a world of devices and applications and services that all function together. But to achieve this notion of mobile everything, there are actually a lot of different elements that have to come together and be connected together to create a complete solution. So what I'm going to do in my presentation is walk you around the circle and describe each of the different elements and what each of them do in order to complete that whole solution. I'll start with devices. Now, I'm a hardware guy, so devices are important to me, but also I think for most people, devices are those things that we use to get access to the information. So, we get very passionate about these devices. In fact, when it comes to devices, you see a lot of people arguing over which devices are better, and even within the IT industry. In fact, some devices get people so excited, I think it distorts their view of reality. It's kind of like when a dog sees a squirrel. Any of you see the movie Up, the Pixar movie? The dog sees the squirrel. If you own a dog, you know what I'm talking about. Dog's perfectly calm, everything's going along fine, all of a sudden, squirrel! Dog goes nuts, kind of loses a sense of reality. That's what happens with a lot of these mobile devices. All right, before we get into the specifics of the mobile devices, let's go over the definitions, because there are a lot of different things out there. Now, we all know what a PC is, but IDC's definition of a PC is a device that has a desktop operating system. That's not desktop versus notebook, but desktop versus mobile. A netbook, which we also call a mini notebook, is a smaller version of a PC desktop OS. Tablet PCs have been around since 2002, and they run, again, a full desktop operating system. But quite honestly, they haven't really sold that well. The category that everybody wants to talk about these days is media tablets, the iPad, the Motorola Xoom, the Samsung Galaxy Tab. This is where the excitement is. Now, IDC's definition of a media tablet is a device that has a mobile operating system and the other characteristics you see. And finally, then, there's smartphones. And with a smartphone, of course, there's a mobile OS and a screen of 5 inches or less. Now, the reality is it's kind of hard to keep track of all these things because, there's so many different things out there. Squirrel! Look at that squirrel. It's got a Motorola Atrix 4G. That's an Android phone that's running Gingerbread. It's got a Tegra 2 GPU, CPU, and it's got a laptop dock. If I had that, that's the one device I would need. Oh, God. Sorry, I'm just getting a little distracted. All right, let's think about clients. When we think about clients, it's typically been Wintel. Windows running on an Intel or x86 architecture. But nowadays, a staggering array of devices. Different form factors, different colors, different everything. In fact, there's so many different devices and so many choices out there that what we're finding is these things are very personal, and the choices you make are very personal. And so people have different sets of devices. You, sir, for example, may have a Windows-based PC, an Android phone, and an Apple iPad. You, ma'am, on the other hand, may have a Windows-based PC, a BlackBerry, and an Amazon Kindle. Everybody has different devices, and that heterogeneity is going to continue. Now, here's another interesting point when it comes to IT. More and more of these devices are being purchased by the individual. We did a survey last fall of about 1,500 IT buyers, asking them about who bought the different devices in their organization. And we know from previous research that PCs, 95% of PCs in a business are bought by the business. But for smartphones, 50%. Media tablets, only 20%. So what we're seeing is that more and more of these devices are being owned and therefore managed by the individual. So the reality is what we're seeing is that people are buying, owning, and using multiple devices. And what happens is they're going to pick to use different devices depending on the situation they're in, the workload they have, the physical location they're in. These are the kind of things that matter. Now, some of you might say, well, but I can do the same thing on all these different devices, so why should I get all these devices? Well, yes, you can, but there are degrees of usage. So think about it this way. I can do email on my smartphone, I can do a little bit more email on my tablet, and I can do a lot more email on my notebook. Let me give you a story to give you an example. I was at an analyst event right after the launch of the original iPad. I saw a guy there that I know from another firm, and he was typing away on the screen of the iPad, and I said, oh, how do you like it? He said, oh, I love it. I'll never use anything else again. Fast forward 6 months later, another analyst event, I see him. He's typing away on his notebook. I'm like, hey, what happened? I thought you liked the iPad. He says, well, yeah, I just got back from a business trip, and I had like 300 emails. I'm like, oh, okay. So it depends on the situation and, in fact, the location. So the reality is that one device, yes, maybe we only want to carry 1 or 2 devices, but we're going to buy multiple devices. One device does not solve the problem. In fact, let me share with you another interesting data point. We did a survey of people who owned or were considering purchasing iPads in December of last year. And now, the demographics of this group, I will admit, were very high. In fact, the average income was $90,000 worldwide and almost $100,000 in the U.S., 50% college educated. So not the general market, but still the kind of people looking at media tablets. And we said, how many other devices do you own? Here's what they told us. Ooh, how did that get so small? Anyway, what it should say is 4.8 devices per person on a worldwide basis, 6.6 devices per person. And what we said by devices was laptops, desktops, media tablets, smartphones, not connected TVs, but basically mobile devices as well as PCs. So clearly, what we're seeing is people are using multiple devices. Now, everybody talks about cannibalization. The thing about cannibalization is, the idea, by the way, is that if you buy one thing, you're not going to buy something else. But that's based on a false presumption, which is that people want only one device. They want more than one device. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't some choices being made between different devices, and there's choices between primary devices and companion devices. But the fact of the matter is, people are buying and using these different devices. What is impacted from our survey, we also asked them, if you bought an iPad, how much has that impacted the use of your other devices? And sure enough, things like netbooks, 30% less, used 30% less once they had an iPad. Even notebooks were used 25% less. So there is usage cannibalization, but the purchase cannibalization isn't quite as clear as some people tend to make it out to be. Now, again, there's a lot of things to keep track of, and it's hard to remember all these different elements, but it's something. Squirrel! That squirrel's laughing at me because he's got the white iPad 2 before it even came out. It's got a Core A5 too. It's got cameras. It fixes all the problems with the first iPad. If I only, darn squirrel, stop distracting me. All right, come on, let's think about the numbers. Let's talk about the actual forecast of all these devices. So if you look at this, this is a chart of all what I'll call more the companion type devices. Tablet PCs, as I said, have been around for a long time, but the reality is they just haven't sold that well because Windows may be touch enabled, but it's not touch optimized. It really doesn't give you a great touch experience. It's always keyboard first, touch second. Now, netbooks have been was a very strong growing category, but what we saw is that over time people recognized it's not quite doing for them what they wanted. So instead, of course, we see this huge growth in media tablets. And as you can see from our forecast, we think it's going to be a strong market. But let me be clear, it's not necessarily going to take over the world. Again, another couple of data points from that survey we did. Remember the demographics of what I described to you. Even amongst that high-income demographic, when we asked the people who didn't buy an iPad why they didn't, 70% of them said it was because the price was too high. Well, wait a minute. All of the other tablets out there are more expensive than the iPad. So you think people are just going to magically buy them? I'm not so sure about that. Plus, there are a lot of issues around data plans and data plan pricing. I'll get to more of that later. The other thing to be aware of is we know what Apple's done so far. We believe through the rest of this year, Apple will still dominate. So let's say we give Android 30% by the time the end of the year comes. Well, if there are 50 vendors fighting for 30% share, you do the math. What's the market share going to be like for those guys? Now, the other thing to bear in mind is, let's look at these devices in relation to everything else. So I'm going to change the scale on the left-hand side, plot the same numbers, but then show you the more primary categories. Smartphones, PCs overall, notebooks. And you can see that despite rumors to the contrary, the PC is not dead. So let's be clear on that. PCs are still going to be an important part of what we do. The other devices are as well. In fact, if you'll notice, as Frank pointed out, in 2011, smartphones will actually surpass PCs as shipping more, and then moving forward, of course, it maintains that way. So we've talked about devices. Now, when you buy a device, really what you're buying is the whole user experience. And the UI is typically delivered by the platform, which is the operating system. And underlying it, of course, is the chip architecture. So let's talk about platforms. So I did an interesting exercise. I added up all of those devices I showed you on that last chart. PCs, smartphones, media tablets, all those things. Then I overlaid the operating system or platforms for those different devices to get a view of what's the platform picture. So here's what it looks like in 2010. First of all, there were about 700 million devices. That's PCs, smartphones, again, all those things. And you'll notice about half of them are Wintel, Windows-based PCs running on Intel. Interestingly, the second largest group was actually the Symbian operating system, which Nokia uses on their smartphones, running on ARM CPUs. Now, in the US, that wasn't a big factor, but around the world, of course, Nokia had a huge share of smartphones. Third was iOS, that's Apple, on the iPhone, the iPad, the iPod. And then Android-based phones and tablets were fourth. Now, watch what happens when we move forward to 2014. First of all, look at the number at the bottom. We more than double the number of total devices out there. Again, people buying multiple devices. But look at the chart. So while the PC may not be dead, when we think about Wintel as a platform in 2014, we're only at about a quarter of all the devices. Android-based devices, again, tablets and phones and other devices, are also just over a quarter. iOS. But then finally, look at the other slice. That other slice is WebOS. It's the BlackBerry software. It's Windows running on ARM even. There's a little bit of that. All kinds of different things. So a huge amount of heterogeneity. Like clients, we're not getting more converged. We're getting much more diverged. All right, now let's talk about the applications. Because, again, at the end of the day, what we run on all our devices is applications. So it's critical to think about what kind of applications are going to be out there. Now, Frank already mentioned to you, the numbers of applications. But there's also, in terms of the types of applications, there's a huge amount of different types. We've got all kinds of personal applications. We've got work applications. And by the way, I almost forgot to mention, apps are important not just for mobile devices, but for PCs. People tend to overlook the fact that, there's a reason why we're still using PCs, because there's a lot of applications that run on PCs that we still need and want. And that's going to continue to be the case. But now in addition to those personal and work, we see some interesting new technologies. Augmented reality. The idea of using cameras or sensors in the device to give you more information. For example, point your device at a building with an augmented reality app, and it might give you a live video feed and then information on top of that. Or you've seen the applications that use the GPS and the sensors in the iPad. When you point it at the sky at night, you can see which constellations you're looking at. Very cool, interesting new kinds of applications. And when it comes to mobile commerce, we're going to start to see the introduction of more NFC or near-field communication-based sensors and devices. When you go to Japan to ride the Tokyo subway, you use the Suica system, which uses their mobile phones as a contactless payment system. You can also use that for vending machines. We expect to see more and more of that when it comes to in the US later this year. All right, so let's also talk about distribution. Now, first of all, there's getting the physical devices out there. And one of the big debates we've seen over the last few years is, what role does the telco channel play in some of these other smart connected devices? And again, I'll share a data point from that survey we did of iPad owners. Actually, only 7% of people worldwide, this survey, by the way, was in 5 countries, US, UK, Germany, France, Japan. Only 7% of people worldwide bought their iPad through a telco, and in the US it was less than 2%. And there's some challenges around some data plans that I'm going to get to, as I mentioned, in a second. Now, when we think about applications, Frank mentioned this briefly, the real beauty of application distribution is in app stores. And app stores are a great thing. There's no question about it. It's a great way to distribute your applications, update your applications, all the things that Frank already mentioned. And in fact, what we're finding is that some vendors, especially, again, if you look at the world of Android-based devices, where there's a lot of worries about commoditization, people are starting to create their own app stores because they want to have a connection with the customer and they want to own that customer relationship. So the problem is, app stores, we think, are quickly going to be too much of a good thing. All of a sudden, everybody is going to have an app store. And the beauty of the app store model that's very clean right now, we think is going to get very messy. But it's still important because, again, this is all about owning the customer. What's the greatest thing about the Apple App Store? It's the fact that they have all your credit card numbers. So if you want to buy something, you just go onto the store and click buy, done. So when Amazon starts to move to offer Android-based applications and they've got one click, that could be an interesting challenge for the Android marketplace and for other vendors trying to figure this whole thing out. So great opportunity, but a lot of potential for confusion. All right, so let's talk about connectivity. Now, all these devices long to be connected. They are, by their very nature, connected devices. And most of the focus has been on 3G and 4G and mobile broadband. But I tell you what, let's not overlook Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is critically important, and the beauty of Wi-Fi is the bill of materials cost adder for Wi-Fi nowadays is almost zero because Wi-Fi is being integrated into other core chips that are at the basis of most devices. So it's very inexpensive to add Wi-Fi. So as a result, everything has Wi-Fi. And that's critically important as we start to move towards sharing 3G connections over Wi-Fi. So let's talk about some of this. The challenge that we see is that people want to have connectivity, but they want it to be cheap. You know, of course carriers need to make money, and the carriers have a certain limited amount of bandwidth. But the challenge is if every single device has to have a data plan, people are like, I don't think so. The analogy is kind of like saying, oh, you have more than one PC in your house? Oh, well, you need a dedicated DSL line for every PC in your house. Of course not. That's what routers are for, right? So why shouldn't we have the equivalent of a wireless broadband router? And in fact, indeed we do. We've seen things like the Sprint Overdrive that provides one 4G radio, one data plan, shared Wi-Fi. We've seen phones and tablets and other devices start to integrate tethering. That is, again, the ability built into the device of sharing a data connection. Now, the problem is right now, it's not very well known, it's not very well understood, and the pricing is still a little bit messy. I mean, again, when we asked people who didn't buy an iPad with 3G, why didn't you get the 3G one? The answers, 41% of the people said the data plan pricing was too high, 40% said they preferred free Wi-Fi, and 35% said they don't want to pay for multiple data plans. And here's another interesting point. If you look at the number of people who are actively using and paying for 3G on an iPad, it's less than 20%. Let me tell you how I get there. About 50%, a little bit less than 50% of iPads sold have a 3G radio. Based on the survey we did, about 70 to 75% of those people actually turn it on. Some people get it just in case. But then, only 50% of those who turn it on say that they use it at least once a week. Well, I don't know about you, but if I'm not using something more than once a week, I'm going to stop paying for it. So quickly you realize that yes, 3G and 4G connectivity is interesting, but we have some serious challenges there. And that's going to be a big factor as we move forward and we think about all the connections that need to happen here. So the importance of tethering and multi-device data plans, I cannot emphasize enough. All right, so we've looked at the devices, platforms, applications, and let's be honest, it's chaos. All kinds of different platforms, all kinds of different applications, all kinds of different devices, different kinds of networks. How are we possibly going to make sense of all this? Well, here's what we need to do. Think about services that tie these devices together. Now, the fact of the matter is that it's not really as far-fetched as it sounds. There are actually a lot of things out there that already do this. I mean, think about email. If you read an email on a device, on one platform, and it's marked as read if you switch to another device on a different platform. But imagine what it would be like if when you read an email on one device, it didn't show up as read on another device. It would be horrible. But that's what we're putting up with already with all our other kinds of applications and data. We need to fix that problem. Now, when it comes to media, thankfully, we've seen some improvements. If you think about Amazon's Kindle application, for example, you can download the Kindle app on many different platforms, you can buy a book once, and you can start reading a book on one device, then when you switch to the other device, it knows what page you're on. And so that kind of seamless experience is exactly what we need to see across all of our applications, our data, and our services. So really, ultimately, what we want is we want all these different elements to work together as a system. Again, another quick data point. 2/3 of the people of the iPad owners said they share data between their iPad and their other devices, but guess what they primarily use as a means to share that? Email. Well, come on, that's not the best way to do it. We need to figure out a smarter, better way to share data across all these devices. Now, some of you might say, well, gosh, this is easy, Bob. It's cloud computing. Put everything in the cloud, and then everything, you just have these thin clients that connect. Well, let me ask you this. First of all, how many of you have a thin client? Yeah, 0. Because there are challenges around the thin client model. It does work for certain environments, but for most people, there are some challenges. So you've got to be smarter about it. You've got to use the local capability of the device. I mean, think about it. Even your phone has gigabytes of storage, and it's got an application processor that's as fast and as capable as the PC CPUs of just a few years back. So it's crazy not to leverage these things. So what we need is a hybrid model, something where we use the local device, the local storage, and we use the cloud. And it's that combination of things that we want to have work together. So if I go back to my model for Amazon with the Kindle, you've got a local application, and then you leverage a shared cloud infrastructure. And it's that back and forth that makes all these things work. So, finally, indeed, let's talk about the role that we see the cloud playing. Now, at the beginning, I promised I would talk to you about epistemology. So let's do that. The word meta, first, the etymology of meta is a Greek prefix that means after or besides. In epistemology, or the study of the theory of knowledge, meta means a thing of things. So think of metadata. Metadata about a picture, a digital photo, is information about that photo. So what I would argue is what we need is a meta platform, a platform of platforms, something that can tie all these different elements together. Let me show you what I mean. So along the bottom here, I have all these different devices, and the colors are meant to be a rough approximation of the market share by platform within each of these different devices. And what you'll see is it's a big mess. Nobody owns the platform across all these devices. Again, we have a huge amount of platform diversity and device diversity. So how are we going to make these things work together? Well, first of all, we add a layer of synchronization. We add the ability to move content across these different devices, across these different platforms. Then, let's think about content. We don't necessarily want to have all of our content on all of our devices. So we can leverage the cloud and provide content that we can, again, get access to across these different devices and platforms. On top of that, we can think of other kinds of services, security services, online storage, the ability to get to my data. There's lots of interesting opportunities here. But ultimately, what we need to do is to tie it all together. And that, indeed, is what the Meta platform is all about. I don't know what happened to my font here. Anyway, the Meta platform, now you could say it's the cloud, but it's not really the cloud. It's a part of the cloud. It's a means of organizing all these different elements. So you can imagine companies like Google and Apple and Microsoft all working towards this concept. Now, nobody's got the whole thing, but think about Apple. iTunes is your synchronization layer, and MobileMe is your Meta platform that provides access to other kinds of content. In the case of Google, it's more of a cloud-based phenomenon. In the case of Microsoft, they've got Live Mesh for synchronization, and you could argue that something like Passport is their means of authenticating, and Windows Live are some of the services that they want to provide. The problem in the case of Microsoft is they only want to support their platforms. Well, guess what? That's a problem, because people aren't always going to have Microsoft platforms. But here's the important thing to remember. It's really about data. It's about your data. Because at the end of the day, what you care about is your data. And you want access to your data across these platforms, across all of these different devices. So really what we're talking about is the idea of being completely independent of our devices. We want a portable digital identity. That is, all of our stuff, our data, our applications, our content, our services, and we want to be able to get at it regardless of this variety of platforms out there. So, now, let's be honest. If we think about putting all this together, there's a lot of elements, but the pieces are in place. But here's the critical twist. instead of focusing on the elements, turn it around onto the individual. What we want to do, remember, is not just make all the things work together in an easy way and consumerize IT. We need to individualize IT. We need to figure out a way so that a given individual, regardless of the devices they have, can get access to the things they want. That's ultimately the goal of what we want to do. Now, let's be honest. It's not exactly a simple view. Even that picture was incredibly complicated. So making all these things work isn't going to be easy. This is the challenge of the consumerization of IT. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of concerns around some of these data plan pricing models. Something is going to need to budge. We're starting to see the beginnings of it, and hopefully we'll see more of that as we go on, because connectivity across these devices is going to be essential. And what's the white elephant in the room? Security. Think about it. I just described a world where now there are multiple ways in for every individual, multiple ways for the bad guys to get in from every single individual. I also described a world where all this data is organized in one place, even higher risk. So there are some serious challenges going on. So we need to think beyond the idea, for example, of antivirus or security software for a given platform. We need a security service that works across my entire portable digital identity, something that can protect me no matter where I am and no matter what I'm doing. That's the kind of thinking we need to have happen. So, what do you do? Well, if you're a hardware company, as Frank had mentioned, you need to diversify your options. You're going to need to have as wide a variety of different devices as you possibly can. And you've got to figure out even things like colors and touch and feel. I mean, these things are like fashion now, in terms of what devices people are buying these days. If you're a software vendor, it's not good enough to say, well, I'm going to support Wintel or I'm going to support iOS. You need to support lots and lots of different platforms. I mean, if you think about it, the Netflix application is probably available on 7 or 8 different platforms. And that's how they make their experience seamless. So if you want to make your experience seamless, you have to think the same way. And if you're a tools developer, there's a great opportunity in figuring out how do I bring these tools and to enable the development of multi-platform support. If I'm a service provider, I'm device independent, I'm platform independent. Maybe I can provide the glue and the synchronization that enables these devices to talk to each other and be more than just the pipe. If I'm an IT manager, I've got a huge challenge on my hands. Remember what I said earlier, a lot of these devices are being bought by the individual. Now, you could stick your head in the sand and say, no, we're not going to allow any of that on our network. And of course, some people are doing that right now. But let's be honest, and remember what Frank said. The market follows the solutions. These are the solutions. So you need to figure out a way to enable access to the applications and data that you're going to be comfortable with, and that's going to vary from industry to industry, to make this work. But people are going to want access across this. And remember, everybody needs to turn their thinking around inside out and go from the individual out and think about how does their solution help enable that kind of an ecosystem. In order to do that, I think we're going to see a lot more alliances and partnerships that help people fill in the different pieces of that meta-platform puzzle. Some companies will have a lot of pieces, some people will just have the glue between certain layers, but there's lots of interesting combinations and opportunities. So, final thoughts. I hope I've made it clear that we are indeed in a new era. This era of multiple devices per person is the new reality, and it's simply not going to change. So you have to plan accordingly. And the connectivity across all these devices is essential. And the cloud is an important piece of it, but it's not the whole thing. This is not cloud-only computing. In fact, let me go on the record and say, a cloud-only computing model like Google Chrome, doomed to fail. Not going to happen. Because you can't depend on that connectivity always being there. It's for the same reason why thin clients are a tiny percentage of the overall PC market. And finally, remember that while there is indeed convergence, it's not in these devices, it's around the data and services. If you want to think about it this way, it's like a personal cloud around the individual with their platforms, their devices, their services. Ultimately, that's what it is that we want to achieve. So, in the immortal words of David Lee Roth and the Van Halen brothers, if you haven't gone in yet, it's time to jump.